Superhero media has undergone a drastic transformation over the decades, especially in terms of how violence is depicted. From the early days of sanitized, family-friendly cartoons like Spider-Man and his amazing friends to the blood-soaked battles of the boys in Invincible, the portrayal of superhero action has become increasingly graphic. This shift raises an important question. Why do modern audiences crave more visceral, realistic violence in their superhero stories? So, in the early days of superhero television, networks had strict content regulations, limiting the level of violence that could be depicted. Shows like Super Friends and Spider-Man and his amazing friends presented heroes and villains in a way that was safe for children. Fights were often depicted with minimal physical contact, and characters would typically be knocked out rather than seriously injured. Even in the 1990s, when superhero animation became more sophisticated with Batman and Spider-Man the animated series, violence was still largely implied rather than explicitly shown. The idea was to focus more on adventure, heroism, and moral lessons rather than the brutal consequences of combat. By the 2000s, superhero storytelling began evolving toward a more mature audience. Shows like Justice League Unlimited and Wolverine and the X-Men pushed the boundaries of violence, though they still remained within the limits of network television standards. At the same time, live-action superhero movies, particularly those from Marvel Studios, began to showcase more intense action sequences. The Dark Knight trilogy demonstrated that superhero stories could be grounded in realism, and while they weren't overly graphic, they depicted violence with more weight and consequence. But then, the true turning point in superhero brutality came with the emergence of shows like The Boys and Invincible. Unlike their predecessors, these series do not shy away from the sheer destructiveness of superpowered combat. The Boys, based on the comic by Garth Ennis, presents a world where superheroes are corrupt, narcissistic, and wield their powers with reckless lightheartedness. Violence is depicted in an unfiltered, gruesome manner, with characters being torn apart, exploded, or maimed in ways that are shocking, yet realistic within the world's context. Similarly, Invincible, adapted from Robert Kirkman's comic, portrays superhero fights with an unprecedented level of carnage. Unlike traditional animated superhero shows, Invincible does not shy away from the physical toll of superhuman battles. The infamous Omni-Man massacre in Episode 1 sets the tone, demonstrating that unrestrained power leads to devastating consequences. These violent sequences are not just for shock value, they serve as a narrative tool to highlight themes of power, responsibility, and the fragility of human life. In contrast, mainstream superhero franchises like the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the DC Extended Universe have taken a more restrained approach to violence. While their films contain intense action, they rarely show graphic consequences. Characters are punched, blasted, and thrown through buildings, but explicit gore is almost always avoided. The MCU, for instance, maintains a PG-13 rating for accessibility, ensuring that its violence remains stylized rather than realistic. The DCEU, particularly with Zack Snyder's darker take in Man of Steel and Batman vs Superman, features more brutal action but still avoids the extreme gore seen in The Boys and Invincible. However, Marvel has started experimenting with more mature storytelling in projects like Logan and Deadpool, both of which feature R-rated violence. Some recent projects like Marvel Zombies animated series indicate a willingness to embrace more explicit content, though likely not to the extent of Invincible. On the DC side, Peacemaker leaned into more graphic violence and dark humor, showing that mainstream studios are sometimes willing to push boundaries when the story calls for it. When you think about it, you will realize that modern audiences gravitate toward more graphic superhero content due to a growing desire for realism and consequence. Earlier superhero media, especially in the Silver and Bronze Ages of comics and their subsequent film adaptations, often depicted battles where heroes emerged unscathed, reinforcing an idealized, sanitized version of the conflict. The lack of lasting injuries, collateral damage, or psychological toll on heroes and civilians created a form of escapist storytelling that, while enjoyable, felt increasingly disconnected from reality. In contrast, today's audiences have become accustomed to more grounded and emotionally resonant storytelling across genres. From prestige television dramas to modern action films, there is a greater expectation for narratives that reflect the complexities of real-world conflict. As a result, the cartoonish lack of consequences in traditional superhero stories can feel outdated. The boys in Invincible tap into this shifting expectation by presenting violence not merely as spectacle, but as a natural extension of superhuman conflict. When beings with godlike abilities clash, it stands to reason that the destruction would be immense, and the toll, both physical and emotional, would be severe. This approach adds weight to superhero stories, making the stakes feel higher and the world more immersive. Additionally, there is an increasing appetite for deconstructive storytelling. Traditional superhero narratives often follow clear moral structures like heroes are good, villains are bad, and justice prevails in the end. While this framework has been the foundation of superhero media for decades, modern audiences are drawn to stories that challenge these binaries. The rise of anti-heroes in popular culture demonstrates a fascination with complex, morally ambiguous figures, rather than the infallible paragons of justice seen in earlier depictions. Shows like The Boys capitalize on this trend by forcing viewers to confront uncomfortable truths about power, corruption, and the ethical dilemmas inherent in vigilantism. Rather than presenting superheroes as purely benevolent figures, these stories explore how individuals with unchecked power might behave in a realistic world. The Boys, for example, critiques the commercialization and political influence of superheroes, portraying them as flawed, self-serving individuals rather than selfless protectors. Invincible, while retaining a more traditional coming-of-age superhero narrative, still delves into the brutal reality of what it means to be superpowered, showcasing the devastating impact of battles on both heroes and civilians. This shift toward more mature, consequence-driven storytelling reflects broader changes in audience expectations. As society becomes more aware of systemic power imbalances and the complexities of real-world justice, the allure of simplistic good versus evil narratives fades. Instead, viewers seek stories that challenge their perceptions, provoke critical thought, and explore the darker, more nuanced side of heroism. As the popularity of ultra-violent superhero content grows, it is beginning to have a noticeable impact on Marvel and DC's business model. Audiences who crave more mature storytelling are increasingly drawn to shows like The Boys, Invincible, and Peacemaker, leaving traditional superhero franchises struggling to retain older demographics. The success of these R-rated, deconstructive stories has proven that there is a significant market for darker, more violent takes on superheroes, forcing Marvel and DC to reconsider their approach. The shift is evident in recent industry moves. Marvel, historically known for its family-friendly tone, has begun greenlighting more mature content, such as Daredevil Born Again and Deadpool 3. Meanwhile, DC has experimented with grittier projects like Joker, which became a massive box office success despite its dark themes and brutal violence. The Batman also leaned into a more grounded and intense portrayal of crime fighting, showing that audiences are willing to embrace superhero stories that break away from the traditional mold. If the trend continues, we may see a broader industry shift, with both Marvel and DC adapting to the growing demand for more adult-oriented superhero content. The success of graphic, mature-themed stories could pressure major studios to embrace riskier, boundary-pushing projects. Alternatively, we may witness a clear division in the industry where mainstream studios cater to younger audiences while streaming platforms and independent studios dominate the mature superhero market. Ultimately, the rise of hyper-violent superhero shows and films are challenging the status quo, proving that audiences are no longer satisfied with sanitized action. Whether Marvel and DC fully embrace this shift or continue to walk a fine line between family-friendly and mature content remains to be seen, but one thing is certain: the superhero genre is evolving in response to changing audience expectations. So yeah, that's all for this video. And if you guys enjoyed it or found it informative, then make sure to get subscribed for more of these videos.